The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Grove as Officer James Mercer began his patrol. At 42, with 12 years on the force, Mercer carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the badge gave him power rather than responsibility. His cruiser rolled slowly through the tree-lined streets of the east side, his eyes narrowing behind mirrored sunglasses as he scanned the neighborhood. The east side of Pine Grove had changed over the past decade. What was once a predominantly white area had gradually become more diverse, something that Mercer mentioned often during shift changes, usually with a curl to his lip that said more than his words. His fellow officers had grown used to his comments, some laughing uncomfortably, others looking away. A few had filed complaints over the years, but somehow those papers always seemed to disappear into the system, without consequence. Today was unusually hot for May, the kind of sticky heat that made tempers flare. Mercer had already handed out 3 tickets before noon, each one to drivers who didn't look like the people who had lived in Pine Grove when he was growing up. He told himself it was about maintaining standards in a changing neighborhood, but deep down he knew better. "Dispatch to Unit 17, crackled his radio. Mercer grabbed the handset. "Unit 17, go ahead. We've got a noise complaint at 1420 Oakwood Drive. Caller reports teenagers being loud, possibly disturbing the peace." Mercer recognized the address immediately. Oakwood Drive was one of the most prestigious streets in town, home to doctors, business owners, and at least one federal judge, Eleanor Richardson. Judge Richardson had a reputation for being tough but fair, with a particular focus on police accountability cases. Mercer had testified in her courtroom twice and still remembered the way she had questioned his account of events, making him feel like she could see right through him. "Copy that. En route," he said, flipping on his lights but not his siren as he made a U-turn. He arrived at the scene 5 minutes later. A group of 6 teenagers were playing basketball using a portable hoop set up at the curb. The boys were laughing, trash-talking, and the bouncing ball echoed between the large houses. Most of them were black or Hispanic, which immediately put Mercer on edge in this predominantly white neighborhood. He parked his cruiser at an angle that partially blocked the street and stepped out, one hand resting on his holster, a habit he'd developed over the years that had become almost unconscious. "What's going on here?" he called out, his voice carrying the authority he felt entitled to project. The tallest boy caught the ball mid-dribble and turned. He was maybe 16, wearing a school basketball jersey, his expression shifting from carefree to cautious in an instant. "Just playing ball, officer," the boy said, holding the basketball against his hip. Mercer walked closer, noting that none of the kids looked familiar to him. "You all live around here?" The boys exchanged glances. A shorter boy stepped forward. "I live right there, sir," he said, pointing to a house 3 doors down. "My mom said we could play here because our driveway is too small." "IDs," Mercer demanded. Ignoring the explanation, "We're just playing basketball," the tall boy said, confusion in his voice. "And I'm just asking for ID," Mercer replied, his tone hardening. "This is a quiet neighborhood. We got complaints." "We don't have IDs with us," one of the other boys said. "We're just kids playing ball." Mercer scanned the group, his irritation growing. "Spread out, hands where I can see them." "What? Why?" asked the tall boy, taking a step back. "Because I said so," Mercer snapped, his hand now fully gripping his holster. The mood shifted instantly. What had been a casual game on a hot afternoon was now something entirely different. The boys raised their hands slowly, their faces showing a mixture of confusion and fear, an expression Mercer had seen many times before but chose to interpret as guilt. "Look, officer," the boy who lived nearby started to say. "My mom can come out and—" "Shut up," Mercer cut him off. "I need all of you to line up against that car." He pointed to a parked SUV. The boys moved slowly, exchanging worried glances. From a nearby house, a curtain moved as someone watched the scene unfold. In another time, another place, this might have ended differently, with Mercer checking that the boys weren't causing real trouble and then moving on. But something about these kids in this neighborhood set him off, tapping into a well of resentment he carried like a second weapon. As the teenagers lined up, a new figure appeared at the edge of the scene. A boy of about 14 walked up the sidewalk, headphones on, completely unaware of the situation he was walking into. He wore khaki shorts and a blue polo shirt, his backpack slung over one shoulder. This was Thomas Richardson, the judge's son, returning from his friend's house where they'd been working on a science project. Thomas looked up, saw the police car, and then the officer confronting the group of boys. He slowed his pace, removed his headphones, and tried to understand what was happening. One of the boys in line saw him and shook his head slightly, a silent warning to stay back. But Thomas recognized one of the boys, a classmate from his school. Confused and concerned, he took a step toward the group. "Hey, what's going—" he began. Mercer spun around, startled by the new voice. In that moment, several things happened at once. The tall boy with the basketball moved, perhaps to warn Thomas to stay back. Mercer, already on edge, interpreted the movement as a threat. His hand moved from his holster, drawing his weapon in one fluid motion that spoke of countless hours of practice, but not enough training and restraint. "Don't move," he shouted, his finger already moving to the trigger. Thomas froze, his hands instinctively going up, his face a mask of shock and confusion. The gun went off with a crack that seemed to split the perfect suburban afternoon in two. The sound echoed between the houses, sending birds scattering from nearby trees. Thomas stumbled backward, a look of disbelief crossing his face before he crumpled to the ground, his backpack sliding off his shoulder. For a moment, everything was still, as if the world itself couldn't process what had just happened. Then chaos erupted. The boys scattered, some running for cover, others rushing toward Thomas. Doors opened on nearby houses as residents stepped out, drawn by the gunshot. Someone was screaming, a high, thin sound that cut through everything else. Mercer stood frozen, his gun still extended, looking at the fallen boy as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. It was only when he moved forward and saw the address on the fallen backpack, 14-45 Oakwood Drive, Judge Richardson's house, that he fully understood the magnitude of his mistake. Officer down," he shouted into his radio, unable to admit what had really happened. "I need an ambulance at 1420 Oakwood now." Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with flashing lights and sirens as patrol cars and an ambulance converged on the scene. By then, Judge Eleanor Richardson had rushed out of her house and was kneeling beside her son, her judicial composure shattered as she pressed her hands against the wound in his shoulder, her voice breaking as she begged him to hold on. Officer Michaels, the first backup to arrive, took in the scene with growing horror. The judge's son bleeding on the pavement, the scattered basketball game, Mercer standing with his gun now lowered but not holstered. The witnesses, both the teenagers and the adults from neighboring houses, all telling the same story with shaking voices and pointing fingers. As paramedics worked to stabilize Thomas, Michaels made a decision that would later be called the first step toward justice. He walked up to Mercer, who was now stammering about sudden movements and perceived threats. "James," he said quietly, "I need your weapon." When Mercer hesitated, Michaels added, "Now," with an authority that cut through Mercer's shock, as the ambulance pulled away with Thomas and his mother inside. Michaels read Mercer his rights in front of the community he had sworn to protect. News of the shooting spread through Pine Grove like wildfire, jumping from phone to phone, house to house. By nightfall, everyone knew. Officer James Mercer had shot Federal Judge Richardson's son during a basketball game on Oakwood Drive. And, for once, there would be nowhere for the complaints to disappear to. The emergency room buzzed with controlled chaos as the ambulance doors burst open. Paramedics rushed the stretcher carrying Thomas Richardson through the sliding doors, rattling off vital signs and information to the waiting medical team. Judge Eleanor Richardson ran alongside, her normally composed face twisted with fear, her hand gripping her son's as if she could physically keep him in this world through sheer force of will. "BP dropping. We need to move now," a doctor called out. And just like that, Thomas disappeared behind swinging doors, leaving Eleanor standing, alone in the hallway, her hands stained with her son's blood. A nurse gently led her to a private waiting area. "The trauma team is the best in the state," she said, pressing a cup of water into Eleanor's trembling hands. "They'll do everything they can." Eleanor nodded mechanically, her mind replaying the moment she'd heard the gunshot from inside her study. The way she'd looked out the window to see her son crumpled on the pavement. The officer standing over him, gun still drawn. The memory made her stomach clench. "Judge Richardson?" She looked up to see Police Chief William Hartwell standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. At 58, Hartwell was a career cop who'd risen through the ranks by being politically savvy and knowing which problems to solve and which to bury. "I came as soon as I heard," he said, his voice carefully modulated to convey concern. "How is he?" "In surgery," Eleanor replied, her judge's instinct cutting through her shock. She noticed Hartwell hadn't brought flowers or a card. This wasn't a sympathy visit. This was damage control. Hartwell sat down across from her. "I want you to know, we're taking this very seriously. Officer Mercer has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Standard procedure." Eleanor stared at him, feeling the familiar coldness settle over her, the same detachment that allowed her to preside over difficult cases. "My 14-year-old son was shot by one of your officers while walking home. He was unarmed. He was simply walking home." Her voice remained steady, but each word landed like a gavel. "I don't want to hear about standard procedure, Chief Hartwell. I understand you're upset." "Don't," Eleanor cut him off. "Don't tell me what I am. Tell me what you're going to do." Before Hartwell could answer, Eleanor's phone rang. She glanced down to see it was her colleague, Judge Raymond Thompson. "I need to take this," she said, dismissing the chief with a nod that left no room for argument. As Hartwell retreated, Eleanor answered the call. "Ray." "Eleanor, my God, I just heard. The whole courthouse is talking about it." "How's Thomas?" "In surgery," she said, her voice cracking for the first time. "Ray, he was just walking home." "Listen to me," Thompson said, his voice dropping. "Don't talk to anyone from the department without counsel present, not even informally. I'm calling Angela Chen from the Justice Department. This needs federal oversight from the beginning." Eleanor closed her eyes. "They're already trying to manage me, Ray." "Of course they are. This isn't just any shooting. This is a federal judge's son. They know what's coming." After hanging up, Eleanor sat alone, staring at her blood-stained hands. For years, she had presided over cases involving police misconduct, always maintaining her judicial objectivity, weighing evidence carefully, following the law. Now sitting in a hospital waiting for news about her son, the distance between her professional detachment and this new, terrible reality felt like a chasm she couldn't bridge. Across town at the Pine Grove Police Department, Officer James Mercer sat alone in an interview room staring at his hands. They'd taken his gun, his badge, even his shoelaces as a precaution. The department psychologist had already been in to evaluate him, asking questions about his state of mind that Mercer had answered mechanically. The door opened, and Detective Lisa Ortiz entered, carrying a thin file folder. At 39, Ortiz had a reputation for thoroughness that made her respected, but not particularly well-liked within the department. "Officer Mercer," she said, sitting down across from him, "I need to ask you some questions about what happened today." Mercer looked up. "I already gave my statement." "Yes, I've read it," Ortiz replied, opening the folder. "You stated that you responded to a noise complaint, confronted a group of teenagers playing basketball, and then shot Thomas Richardson because you perceived a threat when he approached the scene. Is that accurate?" "He moved suddenly," Mercer said, his voice hollow. "I thought he might have a weapon." Ortiz studied him. "Did you see a weapon?" "No, but did he make any threatening gestures toward you?" "It happened fast. I made a split-second decision." Ortiz tapped her pen against the folder. "Officer Mercer, we have statements from 6 witnesses, including the other teenagers present. All of them say Thomas Richardson simply walked up to the scene with headphones on, said, 'Hey, what's going?' and you drew your weapon and fired almost immediately." Mercer's jaw tightened. "That's not how it happened." We also have 3 cell phone videos from neighbors, Ortiz continued as if he hadn't spoken. 2 of them captured the entire incident from different angles. The color drained from Mercer's face. I want my union rep. He's on his way, Ortiz said, closing the folder. But there's something else you should know. The FBI is taking over the investigation. What? Why? Mercer's voice rose. This is a local matter. The victim is a federal judge's son, Ortiz replied simply, and there are concerns about potential civil rights violations given the circumstances. As if on cue, the door opened again, and 2 men in suits entered. One flashed an FBI badge. Officer James Mercer. I'm Special Agent Daniel Park. This is Agent Wilson. We'll be handling this investigation from here. By nightfall, the story had exploded across local and national news. Cell phone footage of the shooting, albeit grainy and partially obstructed, played on repeat on every major network. Outside the hospital, a crowd had gathered, holding candles and signs demanding justice. Inside, Thomas Richardson fought for his life, machines beeping steadily as doctors worked to repair the damage done by a single bullet that had torn through his shoulder before lodging near his spine. In the hospital cafeteria, Eleanor sat with her sister Beth, who had flown in immediately upon hearing the news. They picked at untouched sandwiches as CNN played silently on a wall-mounted television, showing footage of the growing crowd outside. They're saying Mercer has a history, Beth said quietly. Complaints filed against him for excessive force, particularly with minority suspects. Nothing ever stuck. Eleanor nodded wearily. That's how it works. The system protects its own. She looked up at her sister. Do you know how many cases like this I've presided over? How many times I've heard departments defend officers who clearly overstepped? I always tried to be fair, to see all sides. And now? Her voice trailed off as her phone lit up with a text from the surgeon. She stood abruptly. They're done. Thomas is out of surgery. The 2 women hurried to the recovery area where Dr. Patel, still in scrubs, met them with tired eyes but a cautious smile. We've removed the bullet and repaired the damage to his shoulder, he explained. He was lucky. If the bullet had been half an inch to the left, we'd be having a very different conversation. He's not out of the woods yet, but I'm cautiously optimistic. Eleanor felt her knees weaken with relief. Beth caught her arm, supporting her as the doctor continued explaining the road ahead. Weeks of recovery, physical therapy, the possibility of long-term nerve damage. It was serious, but Thomas would live. Can I see him? Eleanor asked. Dr. Patel nodded. Briefly. He's still under anesthesia, but he should start waking up soon. Eleanor followed a nurse to the recovery room where Thomas lay, pale and small against white sheets, tubes, and wires connecting him to various machines. She sat beside him, taking his hand gently, careful of the IV line. I'm here, Thomas, she whispered. Mom's here. You're going to be okay. As she sat with her son, Eleanor's phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. The governor had issued a statement. The attorney general was personally monitoring the case. The police union was defending Mercer, calling the shooting unfortunate, but within protocol given the circumstances. Eleanor silenced her phone without looking at it. Politics, posturing, procedures, none of it mattered in this sterile room where her son fought to heal from a wound that should never have happened. But she knew that beyond these walls, battle lines were being drawn. The system that she had, served faithfully for years, was already marshaling its defenses, preparing to protect one of its own. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A nurse entered with a man Eleanor recognized immediately, Mayor David Chen, looking somber in a dark suit. Judge Richardson, he said quietly. I won't intrude, but I wanted to express my personal regrets about what happened to Thomas. And to let you know that I've directed a full review of our police department's training and policies, effective immediately. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging his words without accepting them as enough. Thank you for coming, Mayor Chen. As the mayor left, Eleanor turned back to her son, whose eyelids had begun to flutter. She squeezed his hand gently, feeling something harden within her. a resolve that went beyond maternal protection or professional duty. "It's going to be okay," she repeated, though this time the words carried a different weight. Not just a mother's reassurance, but a promise that what had happened to Thomas would not be brushed aside, explained away, or lost in the machinery of a system designed to protect itself. On the television in the corner of the room, muted news coverage showed Officer James Mercer being escorted into the federal building downtown, his face hidden under a jacket as protesters shouted from behind barricades. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and for once they might not stop until they reached the truth. 3 days after the shooting, Special Agent Daniel Park sat in a conference room at the FBI field office surrounded by evidence boards and case files. The investigation into Officer James Mercer was moving at an unprecedented pace, driven by public pressure, media attention, and the victim's connection to the federal judiciary. Park rubbed his tired eyes as Agent Wilson entered with 2 coffee cups and a thick folder. "You look like you need this," Wilson said, sliding a cup across the table. "Lab reports just came in." Park took a grateful sip. "Anything useful?" "Ballistics confirmed what we already knew. Single shot from Mercer's service weapon." Wilson opened the folder. "But here's something interesting. Mercer's gun had been modified. Trigger pull was lighter than department regulations allow." Park's eyebrows rose. "So he was walking around with a hair trigger weapon while on duty? Was this approved?" "No record of approval in his file," Wilson replied. "And there's more. Tech team finished analyzing his phone. You're going to want to see this." Wilson spread out several printed pages, screenshots of text messages between Mercer and other officers. Park read in silence, his expression darkening. "Jesus," he muttered, reading a particularly vicious exchange where Mercer referred to the changing demographics of Pine Grove using language that made Park's stomach turn. In another message, Mercer had complained about these people taking over after responding to a noise complaint at a birthday party in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood. "There are hundreds more like this," Wilson said. "Going back years." "Any of the recipients report this?" "A few seemed uncomfortable. Most just changed the subject. A couple joined in." Wilson tapped another document. "We also pulled his social media activity. He was careful on public platforms, but he belonged to several private groups where he was less restrained." Park stood up and walked to the evidence board, where photos of the shooting scene were arranged chronologically. "What about his body? Camera?" "Conveniently malfunctioning," Wilson said with a grimace. "He claims he activated it when he arrived on scene, but the footage only starts after the shooting. Department records show 3 previous incidents where his camera had technical issues during controversial stops." "Too many coincidences," Park muttered. He pointed to a photo of the basketball players. "What about these kids? Any of them have previous interactions with Mercer?" "2 of them," Wilson confirmed. "Miguel Alvarez was stopped by Mercer twice in the past year, no citations issued. And Tyler Washington was detained by Mercer last summer for suspicious behavior, which turned out to be waiting for his mother outside a grocery store." Park nodded slowly, the picture becoming clearer. "And the judge's son? Any connection there?" "None we can find. Wrong place, wrong time." Wilson hesitated. "There's one more thing. We interviewed Mercer's former partner, Officer Robert Hansen. Hansen requested a transfer 3 years ago. He was reluctant to talk, but when pushed..." Wilson slid over another transcript. Park read it carefully. "Hansen says he reported Mercer to Internal Affairs twice for excessive force against minority suspects. Nothing happened. He requested the transfer when Mercer pulled his gun on a teenager for jaywalking." Park looked up. "Why wasn't this in Mercer's file?" "That's what we'd like to know," Wilson replied. "We've subpoenaed all Internal Affairs records related to Mercer. The department is dragging their feet, citing administrative procedures." Park's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and stood up. "That's the U.S. Attorney. She wants an update." He gathered the reports. "Push harder on those Internal Affairs records. Something tells me we're just scratching the surface here." At Pine Grove Memorial Hospital, Thomas Richardson sat propped up in bed, his left arm immobilized in a complex sling. The room was filled with flowers, cards, and a stack of books from his classmates. His mother sat beside him, working on her laptop while keeping a watchful eye on her son. "Mom, you don't have to stay here every minute," Thomas said, looking up from the tablet where he'd been watching videos. "I'm okay." Eleanor glanced up with a small smile. "I know. I just like being here." The truth was more complicated. In the week since the shooting, the hospital had become a fortress of privacy in a storm of public attention. Reporters camped outside. Politicians called constantly. The hashtag #Justice for Thomas was trending nationally. Eleanor had taken emergency leave from her judicial duties, but work followed her everywhere, except here in this room, with her son. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Patel entered, followed by a physical therapist Eleanor recognized from previous visits. "Good news," Dr. Patel said after examining Thomas's wound. "The healing is progressing well. I think we can start some very gentle range of motion exercises tomorrow." Thomas brightened. "Does that mean I can go home soon?" "Let's see how you do with therapy first," Dr. Patel replied cautiously. "But yes, I'm optimistic about a discharge later this week, provided you continue improving." After the medical team left, Thomas turned to his mother. "Have they caught him yet?" Eleanor looked up, surprised. They had carefully avoided discussing the case in Thomas's presence. "Who?" "The officer who shot me," Thomas said quietly. "I know. His name is Mercer. The nurses talk when they think I'm asleep." Eleanor set her laptop aside. "He's not running free, if that's what you're asking. He was arrested and has been charged. There's going to be a trial." Thomas nodded slowly. "The other guys, the ones playing basketball, are they okay?" "Yes," Eleanor said, touched by her son's concern for others even in his own trauma. "They've all given statements to the investigators. They're important witnesses." "Good," Thomas said, "because they didn't do anything wrong. Neither did I." His voice wavered slightly. "I just walked up to say hi to Tyler from my science class. I didn't even see the gun until—" "I know," Eleanor said quickly, taking his hand. "None of this is your fault, not one bit." Thomas looked down at their joined hands. "One of the nurses said people are protesting because of what happened to me." Eleanor chose her words carefully. "What happened to you? It's made a lot of people angry. Not just because you were hurt, but because they see a pattern. Other kids have been hurt too, or threatened by people who should protect them. Your case is getting attention because of who I am, but the anger was already there." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "Will it change anything?" Eleanor felt the weight of her son's question, so simple and yet so profound. "I hope so," she said finally. "I'm going to try to make sure it does." At the Pine Grove Police Department, Chief Hartwell faced a room full of angry officers. The FBI investigation had thrown the department into chaos. Agents had seized personnel files, interviewed dozens of officers, and installed themselves in a conference room where they reviewed body camera footage from every officer who had worked with Mercer. "They're treating us all like criminals," complained Sergeant Phillips. 20 years on the force and suddenly I'm getting grilled about private text messages." "They're doing their job," Hartwell replied tiredly, "and we need to cooperate fully." "What about Mercer?" asked another officer. "The union's providing legal representation, but we should be doing more. One mistake shouldn't end his career." Hartwell's patience snapped. "One mistake? Have you seen the evidence they're gathering? Modified service weapon, documented pattern of racial bias, multiple complaints buried by internal affairs. This goes way beyond one mistake." The room fell silent. "The FBI found internal affairs reports that were supposedly lost," Hartwell continued. "Reports that should have been on my desk years ago. Someone in this department has been covering for Mercer. I want to know who." No one spoke. Hartwell looked around the room, at faces he'd known for years, wondering which ones had been part of the problem. "Like it or not, this department is under a microscope now," he said. Every complaint, every stop, every use of force, it's all being reviewed. The mayor's office is talking about civilian oversight. The Justice Department is considering a pattern or practice investigation. Our only path forward is complete transparency. As the meeting broke up, Officer Michaels, who had taken Mercer's weapon at the scene, approached Hartwell privately. "Chief, there's something you should know," he said in a low voice. "About 2 years ago, I overheard Mercer make threats against Judge Richardson after she ruled against him in a misconduct hearing. I reported it to Lieutenant Drake." Hartwell stared at him. "And?" Drake said he'd handle it. "Told me to forget what I'd heard." Michaels looked down. "I should have pushed harder. Maybe none of this would have happened." "Write it all down," Hartwell said grimly. "Names, dates, exact words if you can remember them. The FBI will want to talk to you." He put a hand on Michaels' shoulder. "And Mike, it took guts to tell me this now. Remember that." As evening fell, Special Agent Park stood in front of a wall covered with photos, reports, and timeline notations. The case against Officer Mercer was growing stronger by the hour. Not just the shooting itself, but the years of warning signs that had been ignored or actively covered up. His phone rang. The U.S. Attorney again. "Park here. We just got a warrant for Lieutenant Drake's home and personal devices," she said without preamble. "Judge signed off based on the evidence of obstruction. I want you there when it's executed." "On my way," Park replied, already reaching for his jacket. As he drove through the darkening streets of Pine Grove, Park thought about Thomas Richardson, recovering in his hospital bed, about the basketball players who had witnessed the shooting, about all the other encounters Mercer had over the years that hadn't ended in gunfire but had left scars of a different kind. Most police shooting investigations faded from public attention after a few news cycles. Officers were rarely charged, even more rarely convicted. But this case was different. Not just because the victim was a federal judge's son, though that had opened doors that usually remained firmly closed. It was different because the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the public watching closely. For once, Park thought, the system might actually work the way it was supposed to. And that was both encouraging and damning, that it took such extraordinary circumstances to achieve what should be ordinary justice. The federal courthouse in Pine Grove had never seen such activity. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like strange mechanical flowers. Protesters on both sides of the case held signs and chanted, kept apart by barricades and stern-faced federal marshals. Ordinary citizens stood in line from dawn, hoping for one of the limited public seats inside. It was the first day of United States versus James Mercer, and the entire nation was watching. Inside the courtroom, U.S. Attorney Vivian Rodriguez made final preparations at the prosecution table. At 45, Rodriguez had built her career prosecuting corruption cases, but never one with such intense public scrutiny. She glanced at her second chair, Assistant U.S. Attorney David Kim, who gave her a reassuring nod. Across the aisle, Defense Attorney Richard Bennett arranged his notes meticulously. Paid for by the Police Officers Union, Bennett specialized in defending officers accused of misconduct. His usual strategy, arguing split-second decisions and reasonable fear, had gotten dozens of officers acquitted. But he'd never faced evidence quite like this. The side door opened and Officer James Mercer entered, escorted by marshals. Gone was his uniform, replaced by a conservative Navy suit that seemed to hang on his frame. 3 months of house arrest, while awaiting trial, had taken a visible toll. He sat beside Bennett, eyes fixed straight ahead, avoiding the gallery where Thomas Richardson sat with his mother. Thomas, now fully healed except for some lingering stiffness in his shoulder, leaned toward Eleanor. "He looks scared," he whispered. Eleanor squeezed her son's hand. "He should be." The bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Anthony Castillo entered. Known for his meticulous adherence to procedure, Castillo had been selected precisely because he was neither seen as pro-police nor as an activist judge. "Be seated," Castillo said, surveying the packed courtroom. "Before we begin, I want to make something absolutely clear. This is a court of law, not a public forum for political statements. I will maintain strict decorum throughout these proceedings. Anyone who disrupts the trial will be removed immediately. He turned to the jury box. Bring in the jury. 12 citizens filed in, the result of a painstaking selection process that had taken 2 weeks. Both sides had fought hard over the composition, resulting in a diverse group that included a retired teacher, a nurse, a construction worker, a software engineer, and a grocery store manager, among others. Judge Castillo addressed them solemnly. You have been selected to serve in a case that has received significant public attention. You are to consider only the evidence presented in this courtroom, not anything you may have seen or heard elsewhere. Is that understood? The jurors nodded, some looking nervous, others determined. Very well. Ms. Rodriguez, you may proceed with your opening statement. Rodriguez approached the jury, her manner direct and untheatrical. This case is about abuse of power, she began. About what happens when someone entrusted with a badge, a gun, and the authority to use them fails to live up to that trust in the most fundamental way. She walked slowly in front of the jury box. The evidence will show that on May 15th of this year, Officer James Mercer responded to a noise complaint about teenagers playing basketball. Within minutes of his arrival, he had drawn his weapon and shot Thomas Richardson, an unarmed 14-year-old boy who was simply walking home from a friend's house. Rodriguez turned and pointed at Mercer. That alone would be tragic, but the evidence will show that this was not a split-second error in judgment. It was the predictable result of a pattern of behavior, a pattern of bias, excessive force, and hostility toward people of color that the defendant exhibited throughout his career. She outlined the evidence. The text messages showing racial, animus, the modified weapon, the previous complaints that had been buried, the witness accounts of the shooting itself. By the end of this trial, she concluded, you will see that what happened to Thomas Richardson was not an accident or a mistake. It was the culmination of years of unchecked bias and aggression by an officer who should never have been allowed to carry a badge. Bennett's opening offered a stark contrast. Where Rodriguez had been straightforward, Bennett was emotional, painting Mercer as a dedicated officer working in increasingly dangerous conditions. Police officers make split-second decisions every day that the rest of us have the luxury of analyzing for months afterward, he argued. Officer Mercer responded to a disturbance in a high-end neighborhood not typically known for trouble. When Thomas Richardson suddenly approached the scene, Officer Mercer had to make an instant assessment of potential threat. Bennett acknowledged the shooting was tragic but insisted it was not criminal. As for these text messages and alleged prior incidents, he said dismissively, they have nothing to do with what happened that day. The prosecution wants to put Officer Mercer's entire career and personal thoughts on trial because they know the facts of this specific incident don't support their charges. As opening statements concluded, Judge Castillo called the first witness, Tyler Washington, one of the teenagers who had been playing basketball when Mercer arrived. Tyler, 16 and visibly nervous in a borrowed suit, took the stand. Under Miao, Rodriguez's gentle questioning, he described the basketball game, Mercer's arrival, and the escalating tension. He seemed angry from the moment he got there, Tyler said, like we'd already done something wrong just by being there. And what happened when Thomas approached? Rodriguez asked. Tyler's voice grew quieter. Thomas was just walking up the sidewalk with his headphones on. He saw us all lined up against the car and looked confused. He said something like, "Hey, what's going on?" and started to take his headphones off. That's when the officer spun around and just shot him. Tyler's eyes filled with tears. There was no warning. Thomas didn't do anything threatening, he was just there. Bennett's cross-examination was aggressive, suggesting the teenagers had been disruptive, that they had made threatening movements, that the entire group had surrounded Mercer. That's not true, Tyler insisted, his initial nervousness giving way to firm conviction. We were lined up against the car like he told us to. Nobody moved toward him, nobody threatened him. And you expect this jury to believe that an experienced officer just randomly shot someone for no reason? Bennett asked sarcastically. Before Tyler could answer, Rodriguez objected. Argumentative, Your Honor. Sustained, Judge Castillo ruled. "Mr. Bennett, confine yourself to questions, not commentary." As Tyler stepped down, the next witness was called, Miguel Alvarez, another of the basketball players, whose testimony largely corroborated Tyler's account. Then came 3 neighbors who had witnessed the incident from their homes, one of whom had captured partial video on her cell phone. The video, played on screens throughout the courtroom, showed the moment of the shooting: Thomas approaching, Mercer turning, the gun firing, Thomas crumpling to the ground. The audio captured screams, confusion, and Mercer's voice shouting, "Officer down," into his radio. A hushed silence fell over the courtroom as the video ended. In the gallery, Thomas stared at his hands, reliving the worst moment of his life. Eleanor put an arm around his shoulders. The prosecution's next witness shifted the focus from the shooting itself to Mercer's history. Officer Robert Hansen, Mercer's former partner, took the stand with obvious reluctance. "Officer Hansen, why? Did you request a transfer away from partnering with the defendant?" Rodriguez asked. Hansen glanced at Mercer, then back at Rodriguez. "I was concerned about his conduct during traffic stops and other interactions, particularly with people of color. Can you be more specific?" Hansen described several incidents: excessive force during arrests, unnecessarily confrontational behavior, derogatory comments made when no civilians were present. The final straw was when he drew his weapon on a teenager for jaywalking. "The kid was just crossing the street, no traffic around. Mercer had him face down on the pavement with his gun out." "Did you report these incidents?" "Yes. I filed reports with Lieutenant Drake in Internal Affairs." Hansen's voice hardened. Nothing ever happened. Bennett's cross-examination attacked Hansen's credibility, suggesting personal animosity toward Mercer and career opportunism in coming forward now. But Hansen remained steady, his testimony unshaken. As the court recessed for the day, journalists rushed to file stories, protesters renewed their chants outside, and Officer Mercer was led back to his house arrest. Eleanor and Thomas slipped out a side entrance, avoiding the media frenzy. In their car, Thomas was unusually quiet. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked gently.
"That could have been any of us," Thomas said finally. "Tyler, Miguel, me, we were all just kids doing normal kid things. And he saw us as threats." He looked at his mother. "How many other officers think like him?" Eleanor had no easy answer. As both a judge and a mother, she had seen the justice system from multiple angles, had believed in its fundamental fairness despite its flaws. Now, watching her son grapple with questions no child should have to face, she wondered if her faith had been misplaced. "That's why this trial matters," she said finally. "Not just for what happened to you, but for all the times this has happened without cameras, without witnesses, without a judge's son as the victim." Thomas nodded slowly. "Do you think they'll find him guilty?" Eleanor thought about the evidence. The testimony, the video that no explanation could justify. "Yes," she said, "I do. But that's just the beginning of fixing what's broken." As they drove home, news alerts chimed on Eleanor's phone. Updates about the trial, analysis of the day's testimony, predictions about the verdict. The whole country was watching, waiting to see if this time would be different. If the badge that had protected so many would finally fail to shield one officer from the consequences of his actions, and in a cell-like room at the federal building, Special Agent Park reviewed the next day's witnesses, the ballistics expert who would testify about Mercer's modified weapon, the tech specialist who had recovered deleted text messages, and Lieutenant Drake, now facing his own charges for obstruction of justice. The case was strong, perhaps the strongest Park had ever built against an officer. For the first time in his career, he allowed himself to believe that justice might actually be served. The trial of Officer James Mercer lasted 3 weeks. Day evidence mounted, forensic analysts, expert witnesses, character testimony. The prosecution built a methodical case that left little room for doubt. The defense fought back with technical arguments about police procedure and training, but their efforts seemed increasingly desperate as the trial progressed. Now, on a crisp Autumn morning, the courthouse was packed for closing arguments. U.S. Attorney Rodriguez stood before the jury, her voice steady and determined. Over the past 3 weeks, you've heard testimony from 27 witnesses. You've seen video evidence, text messages, internal reports. You've heard from experts in ballistics, police training, and use of force. All of this evidence tells a clear and consistent story. She walked closer to the jury box, making eye contact with each juror. James Mercer was not just an officer who made a mistake. He was an officer who carried bias and anger into every interaction, who modified his service weapon to make it more deadly, who had been reported multiple times for misconduct that was systematically buried by his superiors. And on May 15th, all of that culminated in him shooting an unarmed 14-year-old boy who was simply walking home. Rodriguez gestured toward Thomas, who sat straight-backed beside his mother in the gallery. Thomas Richardson survived, thankfully. But this case isn't just about Thomas. It's about every person who deserves to walk down the street, play basketball with friends, or simply exist in public without fearing that those sworn to protect them might instead harm them because of the color of their skin or where they live. She returned to the prosecution table and picked up Mercer's service weapon, now secured as evidence. This modified weapon had a trigger pull of just 2.5 pounds, nearly half the department's required minimum. It was a weapon designed to fire with minimal pressure, carried by an officer with documented racial bias and a history of excessive force. That combination was not an accident waiting to happen. It was an inevitability. Rodriguez placed the weapon back on the table. The defense will tell you this was a split-second decision made in the fog of a tense situation. But the evidence shows there was no tension until Officer Mercer created it, no threat until he perceived one where none existed, no danger until he introduced it himself. She concluded by reminding the jury of their duty to uphold the law for everyone, including those who enforce it. We ask police officers to make difficult decisions. We give them authority, respect, and the benefit of the doubt. But that authority must come with accountability. That respect must be earned through their actions. And that benefit of the doubt cannot extend to shooting unarmed children. Find James Mercer guilty. Defense Attorney Bennett's closing argument was passionate, but struggled against the weight of evidence. He emphasized Mercer's years of service, the dangers officers face daily, and the split-second nature of the decision. Officer Mercer did not wake up that morning intending to shoot anyone, Bennett insisted. He responded to a call, encountered a situation that he perceived as potentially threatening, and reacted based on his training. Was that reaction perfect? No. Was it criminal? Also no. Bennett dismissed the text messages and prior complaints as irrelevant to the specific incident. The prosecution wants you to believe my client is a monster, but he's a human being who made a human mistake in a high-stress job that most of us could never handle. As Bennett concluded, Judge Castillo instructed the jury on the relevant laws and the standards for conviction. The charge was serious deprivation of civil rights resulting in bodily injury, with a hate crime enhancement due to the racial component. If convicted, Mercer faced up to 30 years in federal prison. The jury filed out to begin deliberations. The waiting began. 2 days later, as afternoon sunlight slanted through the courthouse windows, the jury returned. The courtroom fell. Silent as they filed in, their faces solemn. Thomas gripped his mother's hand tightly. "Have you reached a verdict?" Judge Castillo asked the foreperson, a middle-aged woman who taught 3rd grade. "We have, Your Honor," she said, handing a paper to the bailiff. Judge Castillo read it silently, his expression revealing nothing. He handed it back to the bailiff, who returned it to the foreperson. "The defendant will rise," the judge ordered.